And so then this whole discipline has risen called supplier relationship management, which I don't agree with. Supplier relationship management has become so important because we're writing bad contracts. And the only thing we have left in our bag of tricks to try and address this is relationship management, because we sure as heck don't have a contract that's going to protect us. We have the most dangerous words in all of procurement, which are failure to comply will result in bid disqualification. So we're telling them this is a bad idea. We want you, we want you to implement this dumb idea. Give us the best price. And they're saying, okay, here you go. Good luck with this.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Proc-N-Roll, your guide to practical procurement. I'm very excited today to introduce you to Omid Ghamami. Omid and I have known each other for, over 2 decades.
Probably 3 decades.
3 decades now. This is pretty stunning. I looked back at your LinkedIn, and you started at Graphite. You started at Intel roughly the same time I started at Intel, 1994. I think maybe I started in the spring, like May of 94, but we started into that same hiring class at Intel. So
we did. It's been quite a journey.
What was your startup job at Intel?
I don't know why they gave me this job, but I was responsible for procuring all of the manufacturing equipment for the motherboard lines. And why they give, a 24, 25-year-old kid that responsibility, I won't know, but it resulted in me working 70 hours a week. I was the first person in every day and the last person out, and I was there on weekends. So it was quite the stint.
When I met you, you were in Arizona. Did you do that motherboard work in Arizona, or were you up at Oregon when you started?
They hired me and didn't know why they hired me. And so I was doing nothing for 3 months. And then they sent me to Oregon, and that's when the heavy lifting began. So
yeah,
I
like that. I like that sort of strategic hiring that they were doing back in those days, when they were just finding people they thought were really smart and really capable. And then, instead of worrying about hiring them into a specific job, they knew they were going to have stuff to do. So, I think, I don't remember what they used to call that program, but, I think it's that it ended up being quite successful. There was a whole bunch of people that came into Intel finance and procurement in those years, and we could rattle through them. But I think back to some really powerhouse kind of talent that came into the company through that process and then got pegged into an opportunity. Maybe, Intel always moved us around to different things, but yeah, well, that's wild to think about it. And as I'm looking at your LinkedIn, like that's your primary kind of, from a corporate experience perspective, that was your career. You were there for almost 20 years.
That's true. Yeah, I was there for almost 20 years, and that's where I really cut my teeth and really got to see things inside and out. And I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of other companies since. And I'd have to say I learned more outside of Intel than I did inside, because when you're inside a company, you're in a silo. When you're working with all sorts of different companies, you get incredible insight. So
yeah. Well, I look back at my time at Intel. I didn't stay quite as long as you did, but almost. I consider it to be just an amazing education in procurement, because when I started at Intel, I had, they hired me into a sabbatical coverage role as an IT buyer for hardware and software in Folsom. And frankly, they just didn't plan ahead and plan on covering this person's sabbatical. I think his name was Rudy or something, and he was headed out on sabbatical, and they needed somebody to step in and cover sabbatical. And that was my introduction to procurement. I thought buyers were like Nordstrom fashion experts. I didn't realize that companies had buyers. Did you, in your education, were you focused on procurement, or did you fell into this as randomly as I did?
Let me tell you something, Conrad. I've spoken at conferences in front of about 30,000 people, and I've kind of kept track. And I always ask them, how many of you came out of high school knowing that you wanted to be in procurement and planned to be in this career? And over around a 30-year period that I've been asking this question in 31 countries, only 4 people have raised their hand. So it's not just me and you that didn't plan to be in procurement. Nobody planned to be in procurement. I didn't take a class in it. I didn't have a book in it. There wasn't a page on it. The word procurement did not exist in 7 years of business study, undergraduate and graduate school. And so academia is completely behind the boat, and then behind the whatever. And when they do cover it, they tend to cover legacy stuff, either highly mathematical supply chain optimization stuff or the, procurement places purchase orders angle, which completely, is a 1970s perspective. So yeah, I got thrown into the fire, and they were proud of that at Intel. You called it baptism by fire back then. And that's what it was.
Yeah. Well, it was an amazing exposure to this whole function to me, and what a great learning opportunity for me. I had the same feeling. Like I when I signed my first contract, I think it was a multi-million-dollar contract, and I think I had like 2 or 3 months at most in the job. And I just remember going home with the same feeling of awe, like, I can't believe this company is entrusting me with this kind of responsibility. It was very empowering. I mean, to be able to come in and the level of loyalty that brought from me to the business, and commitment from me to my job to make sure I was doing the best possible work that I could was spectacular. I've asked that same question of a lot of people as well, and you're right. It's a very small number of people. I am seeing more and more. I came out of school at the Marriott School at BYU, and at the time they didn't have any procurement supply chain classes. Now they do. I think they've hired a couple of people, even that were in that 1990s era Intel group that they hired out of BYU, and brought, some of them have gone back as professors, and so they're teaching classes in negotiation and procurement. But there's nothing quite like being in the job and dealing with customers that are, internal stakeholders that are trying to get stuff done, and you're trying to be, respond and bring value. This gets, frankly, just as an intro to everybody out there that's listening, I'll say when I knew Omid, I knew him like by reputation as the powerhouse negotiator. So in years since then, I know I've reached out to you and said, hey, why don't you come over to this conference, or over, here or there or wherever, and help us understand the power and strength. How do you become an amazing negotiator? And I remember presenting that to you, I don't know, in the last 12 months or so. And you were like, Conrad, I don't need to do that anymore. Like, that's the wrong focus. Like, the idea of, putting bright lights behind the yourself or chair height, and the psychology of negotiation, all these things, you jumped right into a whole different mindset around procurement in terms of delivering value. And that's been percolating in my brain since that conversation, by the way, I think negotiations, like, data is the ultimate killer app for negotiations. If you have data, like, you can do amazing stuff. And I think we'll talk today a little bit about the kinds of data that make it more meaningful to deliver value. But so often we go through the process of doing RFPs, we go through the process of contracts, we go through the process of supplier relationship management. And you got to ask yourself, like, is this just theater, or is this just steps that we're going through? Or is this delivering value to the enterprise? And I think that's what my sense from our conversation is. That's what you've been sort of putting your head around for the last decade or two, as you kind of transitioned through those later years at Intel out to your new focus, as you've met with so many companies trying to help them figure out how to crack this value nut. But all right, too much from me. Tell me what you think about, like, are we just pretending to deliver value, or, is there something else?
So the problem is that the word negotiation is very enticing. It's tantalizing. Everybody wants to be and to be known as a great negotiator. And every single client I have that approaches me for capability building to help elevate the capability of their organization, I always ask them, where do you want to focus? They always say negotiations. They think, that's where the money is. The problem is in my experience, a very 1950s perspective that, the money you're going to save is to be found at the table in negotiations with another person. And that's where you engage in essentially parasitic value creation, where you create value you gain at the other person's expense. In order for you to get 15% discount over the 10% that they want to give you, instead of the 10%, you have to gain 5% parasitically at their expense. It presupposes, so first of all, you don't have a willing or an excited dance partner. You're going to a dance where somebody doesn't want to dance with you, so you're only going to get so far. Or at least not to the music you want to dance to. And the second problem is it presupposes that's where the money is. And in my experience, that's not where the money is. For instance, what my institute has discovered over the years is that on average, the way end users articulate demand and the way they create it, on average has about 18% extra cost embedded. But because we're in a relay race, procurement's waiting for the scope of work or spec. Are you done with it? Are you done with it? And the minute they get it, they accept it as, the holy grail, and they run with it. And they presuppose that the end user knows exactly what they're talking about, and they don't. And so they take a scope of work or spec that has excess costs embedded, and once they go at the table in negotiation with suppliers, those costs are hard coded because you've set that as the foundation. We're going to incur these unnecessary costs. What's the best? So we try and get cost savings off of unnecessary costs. So really the majority of the savings happens at the end user decision level. And if you're not integrated there, we always want to get early engagement to try and, be able to do the things we want to do later, like to put it out to bid and all those things to find out who the right vendors are. But we never get early engagement to actually question the demand itself and streamline it and take unnecessary costs out. And there's performance issues too, which I guess we'll get to later. But in my experience, that's where the real money is. And then you should still try and do things at the savings at the table with supplier. But the approach doesn't have to be parasitic. It can be symbiotic in that you can do things that create value for both parties that increase both their riches. And I have lots of examples I can share with you.
So, yeah, and I'd love to get to a couple of those examples. So just to be clear with everybody, what you're saying is that we end up, this is reminding me of what happens every week when I open up my refrigerator and find all this unused food and throw it away, right? Our stakeholders end up buying a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't get used in the process. It isn't needed, which is really frustrating. I can't tell you how frustrating. Well, everyone feels that, right? You open your fridge and throw away stuff that you thought you wanted, or your family members, committed you to buy, and you bring home and it goes bad and you throw it away, and you just realize this waste is happening. But so 20% of the value that can be extracted, you just can extract by being very clear about what you're buying and not buying stuff you don't need in the process. So we're working really hard to say 5 or 10 or 15%, maybe as high as 20% on something that's already inflated by 20%. We're already paying 20% extra. And if you could figure out how to get that stuff out, way better off.
It's usually not that you're buying too much. That's part of the problem, but that's usually not the main driver. The main driver is usually things like the end user created a custom demand, a custom scope of work or spec when it could have been standard. So there's many counties in Texas that design all their light poles from scratch. And you've got vendors who've got standard light poles for different applications. And here you've got these counties saying, no, we're smarter than the vendor. They create their own light pole design. Well, that creates all sorts of costs and maintenance and spares. And then the supplier is going to disclaim, they're going to want to be indemnified for performance because it's your design and not their design. So one is like customizing something when you could go standard. That creates not only performance risks, but cost and total cost risks. Another one is a design that's overly complex. So sometimes they create an extremely complex design when it could be far, far simpler than how they designed it. Yet another issue is that they solve a problem with the wrong solution. So we had a client that was using the wrong grade of This might not be the best example, but it's a good example nonetheless of just poor cost management. They were buying 0.9995 pure oxygen tubes, which costs $100 a meter for their turbine engines. They were buying a lot of it. And we found out that 0.995 would have worked. And instead of getting 9995 from Germany, they were able to get 995 from down the street for $6 a meter, 94% less. And it was their requirement was too complex. In that case, they overspec'd it. Sometimes the demand is gold plated. They want it to look pretty for whatever reason, or they order bells and whistles and features that they don't need. That's more common than ordering more quantity than you need. Those are some of the ways in which this happens. But you have to remember, as much as most procurement professionals didn't get a degree in procurement, no end users got a degree in end userism. So they're being thrown to they have baptism by fire as much as we do.
Yeah. Well, I'm sensing some real complication in getting here, right? Everyone, my entire 30 years in procurement, everybody, this idea that get involved earlier and you can add more value, I think it plays into exactly what you're saying. But I think most individuals' view of what that looks like is different than what you're saying at the same time. So you can get involved earlier. Does that just mean I start the RFP earlier and I start all these traditional steps earlier, or I actually need to fundamentally change what I do when I start earlier and how that process goes?
Here's the brutal reality that procurement needs to face. And I'm going to say this, it sounds very harsh. The reason end users don't engage us early is because they don't see the value of engaging us early. The sooner we look in the mirror and accept this fact, the better off we'll be. And the reason they don't engage us early, to peel the onion, is that we engage with things that they perceive. They perceive us as engaging to focus on things that are to our benefit instead of things that are to their benefit. So no, they're not going to, want to actively engage early and things like that. So when we engage early, we should be doing it with the focus of understanding, how do I enable your business unit outcomes better? That needs to be the focus. Instead, we focus on how do we enable procurement policy compliance and, procurement this and procurement that. And they don't care about that. They just don't. They care about running their business. So we end up being like the person who knocks on your door trying to sell you something. We need to be going there focused on business unit outcomes. How do we make sure that by entering into this agreement, your business is going to run better? And that means understanding their metrics, understanding their challenges, their deliverables, their day job, all of those things, and speaking their language. And once they do that, then you become a trusted advisor instead of this process node they have to go through before they can get what they need to get their jobs done. So I could elaborate on that a lot, but it's this fundamental shift in philosophy that has to happen. Otherwise, we'll never get engaged early.
It makes a ton of sense to me, right? I remember back in the 90s working in that software, hardware buying role, and there was an expectation that of the, let's just say, $100 million a year that was being spent that I had stewardship over, I would save 15 or 20%. Like the metric that mattered most was cost savings. And we've talked on this podcast endlessly about what about savings versus value. And I think generally Zach, Natasha, myself, and a whole bunch of guests would kind of say, well, add savings / value delivery, and let's bucket them together. We could spend a whole podcast on that, but that those things are kind of table stakes. Like at the end of the day, if you're not delivering value, then you don't deserve to exist. But then if you translate that into, okay, how do we actually deliver value, and what is the value we're trying to deliver, instead of my procurement team's cost savings that I get to report to the CFO versus and this is something I've said 100 times on this podcast and other places, like the purpose of procurement, supply chain, and frankly, a whole bunch of other functions is to enable business success, like you're just describing. We're using different words, but if we are not making the business better helping them to achieve their success and their value, then we're just a roadblock. We're slowing them down. We're it's just, it can, on one continuum, it can be super negative to their success. On the other, the other side of what most people do is probably just neutral to maybe a little positive for the success. And if you can push it all the way to what you're talking about and get to enabling their success, it's a game changer, right? So you show up into this relationship where your agenda is their agenda instead of your agenda is your agenda, right? Like you're showing up and they're wondering why you're slowing them down and why you were even there. That's a transition. That's like a different mindset. And as you go and talk to organizations, how have you helped them deal with this new mindset where traditionally, the CFO and themselves and others and have them stuck in this cost savings or my own agenda versus their agenda? How do you get them across that bridge? And how the real problem I've seen, and I crossed that bridge a while ago in my procurement roles, is everyone always wants a metric. Okay, great job. You went out there and you enabled business success. How's that? Graph it for me and put it in a KPI. And okay, I don't know how to do that. How have you looked at this and measured it to know that it's working well or it's not working?
All right. So you asked a lot of questions actually, and let me kind of give a bifurcated answer, and I'm going to focus more on the second part for now. The first thing we have to remember is we roll up all these cost savings. They go up to eventually to the CFO and the CEO. They get really excited and they say, wow, $18.6 million savings. This is great. I could use this money. Show me where that money is. Well, you see, we gave this money back to the business unit. Okay, what'd they do with it? Well, you see, they spent it. So there is no cost savings, but by the time it rolls up, and that's why procurement rarely reports to the CEO or to the COO, is because they view procurement as this organization generating phantom savings. It's email savings. It doesn't manifest anywhere that they can touch or see tangibly in the bottom line. But you mostly ask an end user question. And the challenge is all of this manifests, all the problems with end users manifest because our processes, every process in procurement from beginning to end is predicated on the flawed concept that the goal of procurement is to acquire goods and services. And that's the root cause of 90% of our problems in procurement. So that mindset has to change. And end users, look, they have a scope of work template or a spec template. Guess what it's designed for? Goods or services. We have, RFQ we send out for goods and services. We have a contract template that says on it it's for goods and services. The problem with all that is goods and services is like a haircut. You will get a haircut, but it might be a hot mess. But you still have to pay for it and you still have to live with it. And there's no refunds on that. And so as a consequence of this, when you just buy goods and services, then there's no performance outcomes attached to that. And what happens is 90% of the time with major purchases, the end user gets exactly what they asked for, but that's not what they complain about. They make procurement's life awful by saying, I'm not happy about this. The quality is not good. The lead time is not good. The customer service is bad. The performance is bad. The uptime is bad. None of those things were contracted for. All that was contracted for was price, delivery date, warranty period. None of those really address these issues that come up every time. And then procurement has to roll up their sleeve and go and get mad at the supplier. And the supplier says, this is not what we contracted for. We're going to have to charge you extra to do these things you're asking for. And so then this whole discipline has risen called supplier relationship management, which I don't agree with. Supplier relationship management has become so important because we're writing bad contracts. And the only thing we have left in our bag of tricks to try and address this is relationship management, because we sure as heck don't have a contract that's going to protect us. If you go and talk to any company today and ask the procurement people what percentage of every day is spent in unplanned activities, the answer will be between 70 and 90%. It will be. And that includes all the meetings that they have scheduled on a regular basis to discuss the unplanned problems that keep coming up. They just know there's a constant flow of problems that run through. That comprises 70 to 90% of every day that these people weren't hired to focus on. So procurement, far from, and I learned this 30 years ago, instead of doing procurement, we're doing firefighting. And then we reward firefighters. That person's really savvy. That person handles these issues, these escalations really well, instead of instilling a practice of being Smokey the Bear and rewarding Smokey the Bears and creating practices that prevent these fires. So when we're in 70 to 90% of every day in firefighting, the business unit is too. The business unit views it as procurement's fault. Procurement views it as supplier's fault. And it's none of those people's fault. It's in reality, it's procurement's fault for allowing the end user to articulate their demand for goods and services instead of for outcomes, which is what we should have started the whole process as. And that is why we have a bad reputation with end users and with business units.
So when I go into IT or facilities or marketing, and I think I know you didn't join me on the podcast here to sell this institute and the training and other stuff that you've done. So my question is more about, okay, I think everyone listening to this is probably like, hey, outcomes, this makes sense. Like, great. I want to go back to my day job now, and I'm going to start pushing outcomes instead of just, product descriptions or something like that, products and service descriptions, price and delivery. Okay, well, I'm this 25-year-old kid showing up at Intel out of MBA school or whatever. This is 30 years ago. And I walk into the IT staff and I start talking about outcomes, and I don't know what network switches are, and I don't know what latency. There's a whole different language in all these categories that maybe I've been around doing this for 10 years, but I've kind of been ignoring because I could just cut and paste off of this and put it there and put it in a contract. How do you make that transition, and how much category or function specific knowledge do you need to effectively guide them? Because I'm guessing this leads to facilitation, but to effectively guide them to an outcome agreement with the supplier versus just a purchase agreement.
That's a great question. So I have a two-part answer. The first part is we have to embrace that the greatest tool we have in procurement is ignorance. I'm able to, you think I'm a light pole expert? I was meeting with the chief procurement officer of Texas, and I was telling her staff, a few hundred people in the room, about this light pole problem that I view it as a problem. And somebody yelled from the back, "You don't understand light poles." And I got closer to the audience and I said, "Sir, it is precisely my ignorance that allows me to make this observation." And nobody said anything after that. They followed me completely. When you're in it so deep, you cannot make these observations of the things we're doing that don't make sense. It's the outsider who has complete ignorance. So embrace the ignorance. But the second part to the answer is, you're a 25-year-old kid and all these things. The second best friend you have is history. So you just have to look at what's eating them alive today. They surely have 2 or 3 contracts that they're ticked off at the supplier. It's taking tons of their time. And so you just take that and gather information about that and say, how much, let's take a look at this supplier you have right now. How much time are you spending on this? What kind of problems? And you keep, as you and I discussed, twisting the knife and making them critically aware of how much pain they're involved with these suppliers. How many hours of escalations are you in? How many times do you have to meet with this? Then you ask them, is this furthering your career? Are you getting awards because of this? Is this getting you promotions? Is this taking away from your day job and the things you'd rather be focusing on? And you know what the answer to all those are going to be. You're leading the horse to water to where they become very, very hungry for a solution. So it's just looking for those pain points. Examples where either they're currently experiencing pain or they recently have, and then you dissect those. And by the way, I lived this back in the early 90s. And that's what was causing me to work 70 hours a week, was the way all the contracts were negotiated. And so I went back, I studied a lot of contract law, and I reversed engineer all these symptoms that were manifesting. into root cause. And what are the root cause that were allowing these to manifest? I created custom contract clauses to become Smokey the Bear, to prevent these from manifesting. And Conrad, within 6 months, I was working a 15-hour work week. So this is not academic. I lived it. And what did I know? I was a 25-year-old kid who only knew how to spell procurement. But it can be done. That's really the answer. One is to embrace ignorance, and two is to use history as your friend to get these people to become keenly aware of this cycle of death that they're involved in, that's taking so much of their time, and create hunger for a solution, just to tell them, let's get you out of this mess. Let's figure out a way to liberate your time. You've told me you don't want to be spending all this time on this. Let's get you out of this, because all of that is going to happen here again. Is that what you want? I can expedite this. I can run this RFP tomorrow. You're in a huge rush. You want me to run with it? I'll run with it. But you're going to have all of that happen again here. And if that's what you want to do, let's go. I'm here to support you. But if you want to get out of that business, I'm here to help you, and I'll invest the time to help you. So
I'm thinking about myself at 25, and I wasn't adequately prepared. And by the way, this is after me going on a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ for 2 years, talking to strangers and knocking on doors. But I walked into the corporate world intimidated by, functions and leaders and other people that seemed, like out of bounds for me to, like, part of it was just my personal comfort. Like, I don't want to go over and talk to a stranger. I'd rather just like push the paper across my desk that came from that stranger rather than open up a conversation and build a relationship. Well, now, as you know, I'm a startup guy. And so I'm on the other side of the table, where you just don't have the luxury as trying to build a business to sit at the table and just move paper across the table from one side to the other. You got to go build relationships. You got to talk to people. But I suspect, and I actually had a conversation with someone that's going to come on the podcast in a couple of weeks here. I suspect that it is true. Most procurement people are introverts. Most procurement people are more comfortable sitting at their desk than, going out to lunch or coffee with a business, like one of these business leaders, stakeholder, a stranger, to actually get, go build that relationship in order to, because it's like, hey, I want to start early. I want to have a seat at the table. But it strikes me that very often procurement is known as a function versus an individual, somebody that can come in and consult with them and enable their business success. I get the formula of, you need to do this and this and this, and that makes sense. But like, this is really hard for me. How do you actually go make that happen?
All right. So first off, I'll say I too am an introvert. So I'm very comfortable pushing paper, but it doesn't work. The research shows, and I learned this a long time ago, that if you really want to engage people, you need to build three things, and that's the know, like, trust. And you've probably heard about that, but I always view it as like a triangle: know, like, and trust. And it's the three legs of the stool. If you don't have one of them, then the stool falls and you fall with it. So it's getting to know them personally, getting to have them like you, having coffee with them and so forth, being friendly with them. And then you need some early wins in terms of the trust. Once you start collaborating with one another, one of the important things is to build the like factor, is to also focus on leveraging the concepts of reciprocity. So if, for instance, they work with you on a deal and they really help you out, go to their staff meeting, to their boss's staff meeting, surprise them, and just do a 2-minute verbal recognition of how this person engaged your department, how well they worked, how their ideas were critical to deal success, how list out the things that they did. That person will be your disciple for as long as you're in the company. They're going to be so indebted to you. So it builds the know-like factor and the trust factor. It builds reciprocity. They want to do things back for you to help you out. And then I would say the third thing is listening more than talking, and really engaging, asking their opinions on things, just becoming the best negotiators are really good listeners, not really good talkers. And the more you listen before you propose something, the more likely they are to agree, because people want to feel heard. And then, when you're ready to propose something, you can ask them, after you've listened to them, I know I've heard you want to do this, you're thinking that, and you propose something, always ask, does that sound reasonable? And there's something about human nature. When you ask, does that sound reasonable? People just agree, because no one wants to be perceived as being unreasonable. So it's just kind of understanding how we as humans tick. So build the know, like, trust factor, leverage reciprocity, and look for opportunities to give them, to create reciprocity where they really feel like they're indebted to you. They want to do more things for you, and then become a really good listener. These are some early tricks. And then you have to have the early wins. You need at least one early win with them and build off of that.
Maybe this is the obvious question, but if I'm a head of procurement or I'm a category leader like I was back in the hardware software kind of buying space, I've got enough volume coming across my desk that it opens up this question of, okay, well, where do I start here? Because this is a different way of working, and I can't tackle everything that's coming across my desk this week in this new outcome-based approach that now I'm actually, in this know, like, trust triangle that you're describing. This isn't as easy as just moving paper across my desk, right? Like, I'm gonna have to go and have a conversation. We might have to go out for coffee, or get to, frankly, after you start building these relationships. I myself have found that the relationship side of my career to be, more rewarding than anything else I've done. Just to have, you and I are a testament of that. Like, we've known each other for 3 decades, and it's awesome to have that kind of network. But where do I start? Where do I cherry pick the stakeholder, cherry pick the subcategory, the supplier, the contract? Like, how do I know where? Because I can't fail on it either, right? Like, I need to win. I need to create a win with them so I can kind of build on the momentum of that.
So when you're looking at any particular business unit, it's actually a mistake to start with. If you're in that stage, very early in the nascent stages, it's a mistake to start with, let me start with the guy or gal who's spending the most amount of money. You want to start with the person who's most sympathetic to procurement, who's most well aligned, because you want to get your early wins with the person who's most likely to want to go to the dance with you, to use that expression again. And that's always the way to go, because you want to set yourself up for failure. Just because somebody else is spending a lot more, that person may not be the best first dance partner. You want to pick the person who's most likely to go to the dance with you, most likely to play along, most already you have a higher probability of achieving a know, like, trust factor with them, and to set a precedent. And you want to create a situation where you have somebody who becomes an ambassador. And we're always trying to police business units to make sure that they align with policy and things like that. That doesn't work. What works is having internal ambassadors who do it for you, so that they're asking themselves, did you get procurement involved? Did you engage procurement? That you need those people inside. So it's starting with the people who is most already well aligned with procurement, is most sympathetic to their cause, is most aligned. That's the person you start with, and not any other criteria, even if it's not the biggest financial opportunity.
Okay, folks, this is a really, really great practical insight, right? Because as we go do segmentation, it's so often that we do exactly what Omid is saying here, which is, let's go prioritize these suppliers or these stakeholders by spend, and then let's start working at the top, right? Because you go through this 80-20 mindset, but there's something else happening here too, right? Like, I'm the nerdy teenager that's sitting on on a chair leaning against the wall during the dance. I'm not out there dancing, and now I've got to learn how to dance. Like, what you're describing here is figuring it out, and building the win. But I don't want to get into this dance with the business and then just completely blow it, because I've never done this kind of thing before, right? Like, I want them to be in it, but I also have some learning to do here, right? I don't know if you gave me a percentage and you would tell me right now, but I would guess very, very few people that are engaging on sourcing activities, supplier activities, procurement activities are thinking outcomes. I would guess it's sort of less than 20%, probably less than 5%. And so everybody's got new language, everybody's got new process, maybe even new templates and everything to think about. So do I have that right?
You're absolutely right. And I remember once I was, presenting this concept to somebody and reviewing all the things. He was an executive, in procurement, and reviewing all the things that have to be done up front. And he told me, we don't have time for all that. And I told him, what you don't have time for is all the nonsense that happens post-contract. This is a one-time activity I'm asking you to invest in. If you choose to forego that, then you're signing yourself up to a season pass or like an annual pass of this kind of activity that never ends until you retire or, win the lottery or something. But and then the light bulb went on that the alternative to spending this time up front to ensure the acquisition of outcomes is a lifetime of pain and suffering, or a career time anyways of pain and suffering that never ends. And it's not like it's rewarding. It doesn't get you promotions. It's all focusing on things that weren't why you were hired. And it prevents you from doing the things that you're supposed to be working on strategy wise.
Well, now I'm wishing back in 1994 when you took your job from, 16-hour days down to 15 hours a week, that you and I had some time to talk, right? Because this is a game changer. And now it's also very clear why you got onto the fast track at Intel so quickly. I mean, you figured this out, which, I don't know if you just stumbled into this on accident or you came in with that deep wisdom and insight that most 20-something kind of participants just don't have. But even understanding these principles, let's get practical. I think everyone listening go, I love this idea, outcomes. I think they're going to, we're all going to go back to our job and we're all going to go back to these patterns and these behaviors and these templates and process and everything that we've done. What resources, you kind of figured this out yourself. There wasn't YouTube available in 94. I don't know if it was from books. You didn't do it in school. So how do I go learn what an outcome-based procurement process looks like?
It's there's not a lot of stuff out there, but a good place to start is the federal government, believe it or not, has some performance contracting literature that's kind of interesting. And so if you look that up, performance contracting, it gives some decent insight on the ideas. But basically what it comes down to, and I've written a lot of blogs and articles and things like that, and also I've given spoken at conferences where I talk about this. That's available online in YouTube. But this idea of, if you want to call it performance contracting, I call it more like, outcome-based procurement. The idea is you have to start with kind of a mission instead of what is it. The fundamental shift, Conrad, is we're not going to focus any longer on what we want to buy. We're going to focus on what we want to achieve. That's like if you don't start with that, you will never succeed in procurement. You will never succeed in outcome-based procurement. Is you start with that, then you have to say, all right, that's what we want to achieve. Now let's break it down into performance categories. Then once you have the performance categories, then you break it into performance indicators. And even so, you need to make sure you're measuring outcomes and not activities. So as an example, the San Francisco Unified School District wanted to shift to a new payroll system, and they paid this very famous supplier. This is public information. I think it was Infosys. Millions of dollars to do that, except they contracted for activities to do this, to do that. I read the whole contract, and the newspaper interviewed me on it and as an expert. 46 pages, I believe, of activities. Not once in the contract did it state that as a consequence of this implementation, the right people will get paid the right amount at the right time. These words were not in the contract. Conrad, they ended up paying them an extra $30 million, if I'm not wrong, There was no contract breach. So, and there was the employees still years later are the wrong people are getting paid the wrong amount at the wrong time. There's a class action lawsuit going on. They didn't do anything wrong. They did exactly what they were contracted to do. Nobody contracted with them to make sure the right people got paid the right amount at the right time. Everybody forgot, but the contract was extremely detailed. So it's getting into metrics that do not measure the activities, metrics that measure the outcomes. Then you need to have pay for performance measures. And then you need to make sure that all the right terms in the contract are defined, because there's tons and tons of terms that are subject to interpretation that have no scientific definition. For instance, you might buy a whole bunch of copy machines and the supplier guarantees 99.9% uptime. And then you go back to them and say, listen, this thing always streaks on every piece of paper. Or no, it's always jamming. Let's say the machine is always jamming. And they say, oh, well, that's part of our definition of uptime. Our definition of uptime includes jamming. Well, there's no scientific definition of uptime. And so by not defining what uptime means, you've left it open to their convenient interpretation and you're stuck. So you have to look at every term that relates to performance and then define it. Let me tell you a story if we have time. I was at a baseball game last week. I had a $1,000 seat with a friend of mine in a VIP section right up in front. It was very posh. He spent the entire night on the phone with the IT supplier whose name shall go unmentioned, but every single person listening knows who this company is, because his hospital systems were completely down. Ambulances were being diverted. They were focusing on paper systems. I mean, for all I know, people might have died, because you can't access their medical record. And if they're having an emergency. And it was the third time this issue had happened in 6 weeks due to this supplier. And I asked him, and I was actually on the drive there. I was listening. I was on the bridge. It was on speakerphone. And I was listening to all this, and he was on mute. And I asked him, what is the guarantee? I said, do you have guarantees for the supplier to, address these issues? He said, oh, yeah, I've got a 1-hour response time contractually. And I said, that's useless. And he said, what do you mean that's useless? And I said, they could respond within 1 hour, but take 5 years to resolve. Its response time is useless. What you need is to contract for resolution time. He said, I never thought of that. We never contracted for resolution time. And I said, that's a big part of your problem here. You contracted. That's the wrong outcome to be measuring. Who cares when they respond? It has to be from the time we communicated to the time they resolved is what we're measuring. And then the fact that this was the third time in 6 weeks and the supplier was not contractually required to do a root cause and corrective action and all, there was like a mess. The guy couldn't enjoy the baseball game. He was off to the side the whole time, up until midnight while we were there, dealing with this mess. And it's just endemic in the procurement ranks, these kind of issues.
Yeah, this is really powerful. By the way, next time you go to the posh baseball game, let's just leave him in the car. Give me a call, and I'll come and enjoy his seat. That sounds like a great experience. But I see that kind of stuff happening all the time, right? And so I love this. You said when you get into the situation, you don't ask what are we buying. You ask what are we trying to achieve, right? That's the big question. That's going to be the difference maker. So folks, don't forget that. What are we trying to achieve? Like, what is business success look like? And, how do we define that business success? I think this is doable for folks. Now, the typical tool we use out here for these kind of engagements with suppliers is an RFP. So does an outcome-based, sourcing activity still look like an RFP, or so use the same kind of tools and templates to kind of gather up commitments or gather up information and pricing? Or how does this layer into the more traditional procurement tools that people are using every day?
Well, you can do RFQ as well, but RFP works very well, provided you've defined the outcomes correctly. If you screw up the outcomes, like what the San Francisco Unified School District did. That was an RFP. Then you'll contract for activities still. So you have to define the heavy lifting will still continue if you define the outcomes wrong. So you really need to think that through. What does it look like when we get there? But you can do an RFQ, whereby you define the specs or you define the scope of work, and you put outcomes alongside that, and you ask the vendor. Now, what that means is you have to ask the vendor if there's any misalignment with what we've asked for and what we want to achieve. We want you to point it out. And a good way to approach this is say 10% of the supplier selection decision will be allocated towards innovative supplier solutions to achieve these outcomes at a lower total cost. And then you're giving the vendor an opportunity to come back and say, listen, you asked for 995 on these oxygen tubes. You could do 995. That's going to take your cost down from 100 to 6. Or, you overly complicated the design here, or you did these things. So one of my clients was a county in Wisconsin. And I found out a story I couldn't believe, Conrad. They told me this happened to the entire state of Wisconsin. They said that they put out a RFQ for traffic to change all their traffic lights to LED. And they put it out, picked the lowest, what the government calls responsible bidder. And then they changed out all their traffic lights to LED. You know how much it snows in Wisconsin. The very first winter, they found out that LED doesn't heat up and it doesn't melt snow. Now they have an entire staff whose only job it is to scrape snow off of traffic lights. What they should have done, and by the way, I went back recently to try and research to follow up on what happened with them. I couldn't find an update, but what I found is every first world country that has snow is replicating this mistake. And what that tells you is these suppliers know exactly what's going to happen. They're not dumb. They know exactly what is going to happen, but procurement is not articulating outcomes and is not giving them an avenue to tell them, guys, this is a dumb idea. And even worse, we have the most dangerous words in all of procurement, which are failure to comply will result in bid disqualification. So we're telling them this is a bad idea. We want you to implement this dumb idea. Give us the best price. And they're saying, okay, here you go. Good luck with this. But if they had thought through performance outcomes and stipulated that in the RFQ, and one of the performance outcomes was sufficient heat dissipation to melt snow, then the suppliers would have been obligated to say, this is not going to do it. We can't do it. And you either need to have a hood that you need, a really long hood that you put on top, or you're going to need to stick with your traditional kind of lights, but LED doesn't get hot. They hadn't thought it through. So they got exactly what they wanted, and they're paying through the nose, and who knows, maybe people are dying because there's got to be a latency in between the time it snows and the time it gets scraped. So anyways,
these are great examples of this principle. So the RFQ, RFP, RFI process is still an effective tool, but just like reverse auctions or any of the other tools, if you go in there not adequately defining the outcome that you're looking for, you're going to end up right down this trap of probably getting what you asked for, which is a good or a service, and not necessarily the outcome. I know we're a little past time here. I do want to ask a couple of questions of the internal stakeholders and partners. Like I'm thinking legal, right? So legal's probably not familiar writing outcome-based contracts. I'm not even sure. Like if I put together an RFQ and I wanted to ask myself, so is this a good outcome or performance-based? Like what I would go do today, because I'd become an absolute AI agent lunatic nut. I would go take that and I would paste it into ChatGPT, or we use Gemini internally, are these tools, is sort of the models behind these tools going to be smart enough to tell me, hey, this is not a good performance-based outcome, or do I just have to kind of guess my way through that? Because honestly, you kind of pointed me to federal, like how the federal government does it. I don't think I'm going to find my way there. So will AI help me, like, at least tell me whether I'm doing a good job or not?
All right. So you asked a lot of questions. Let me just kind of dissect it. First off, there's a fundamental problem in procurement, which is procurement thinks that when a lawyer approves a contract, they're saying it's a good deal for the business. That's unequivocally not what they're saying. They're saying that indemnification, limitation of liability, IP, insurance, these kind of things are acceptable for the business from a risk perspective. Legal is not trained in and is not paying attention to, is this a good deal commercially? Those legal clauses oftentimes don't go wrong even once in a career, but the commercial clauses are the ones that go wrong almost every single deal. They're the ones that make you lose all your hair. And so it becomes incumbent on you as procurement to make sure that that's in place. Here's what you do and do not need to be expert in. You need to be expert in being able to characterize performance outcomes, being able to make sure that the performance metrics are actually measuring results and not activities, making sure that every term that's related to performance is defined in a way that's very clear, making sure there's payment for performance capabilities put in the contract. And what you don't need to be an expert in is actually the content that goes into those things. That's the end user's job. We're letting them off the hook. It's who is it that has to live with these things? It's them. They're the ones coming up with the requests. You train them and educate them on these concepts, then they have to decide what are the performance outcomes? What are the performance metrics? What is going to be the definition of these performance terms? What should the pay for performance look like? What are the key performance outcomes that we should tie payment to? And what should the things need to be? And I forgot one other thing, Conrad, to say earlier, and I'll say it now. The other thing that has to be put in place are remedies. So there's legal remedies and equitable remedies. Legal remedies means when the supplier fails to perform, that they owe you money. But sometimes money's not good enough. Like if I didn't get my capital equipment, no amount of money makes me whole again. I need to manufacture a product. That's when an equitable remedy comes in place. And equitable means money's not good enough. You have to in some way give me performance, be it cost of cover or something else. And so the end user has to, for every single performance metric, you have to ask them, if this is not achieved, then which type of remedy do you want in place and which remedy should it be? And, legal remedies, people always do it wrong. It should be focused on what amount of money would make you whole again, as if the event never took place. So these are the kind of things that have to be thought through. Procurement just needs to know the science of this, but the actual content has to come from the end user. Because if you decide it yourself, now it's your problem. It has to be their problem because they're the ones that have to live with this stuff. They're the ones asking for it. So we should never put that monkey on our back.
So what I'm getting from that, Omid, my question about RFQ is kind of the same thing as contract and legal, which is you can use the templates you have, but in the section where it talks about product and service definitions, you got to quit just talking about the products and service. This is where you document the outcomes and the remedies that are associated with those, with what you're trying to get. So this feels to me like this isn't the hardest part of like transitioning from traditional buying goods and services to buying outcomes is changing how you approach it, how you talk about it with the business, and how asking the right questions and documenting what that business value and outcome is that you're trying to achieve. Like you can put those into the RFQ, the RFI, the RFP, the contract, and go forward from there.
The supplier scorecard. It carries its way all the way through the process until the end. It's actually incredible. And it's just a one-time effort, but nothing defines procurement better than our willingness to put in endless effort post-contract because we didn't put enough effort pre-contract. And so it's just this, I'm asking for way less time allocation overall done up front. Eventually, you have to focus on the outcomes, because after the end user receives the goods or services, that's when they start having outcome-based complaints, right? So eventually you have to face the music. Why not do it earlier?
Yeah, no, I love it. Omid, thank you for all of these great insights. Listeners out there, I've got to tell you, this is a gold-plated episode right here. I like some of the best advice. Most of the best advice in life is usually common sense when you boil it down. I think everyone listening is like, yeah, of course, this makes total sense. There's not a lot of obstacles other than yourself that are holding you back from moving from traditional, goods and service procurement or purchasing to going to these kind of outcome-based agreements and relationships. I'm not going to say that makes it all easy. I'm still the nerdy kid that probably doesn't want to talk to people and get some of that stuff started. But I've got to tell you that this is probably one of those gems that has the power of transforming your procurement organization. If you have a team, for sure, it can transform your career. It can move you from being a pencil pusher, sort of scorekeeper, to being in the game, scoring the points and being the star. Like, this is a career changing insight that you can apply back to yourself and your procurement team to make a real difference. So super awesome to spend some time with you, Omid. Before we wrap up, I have a tradition of asking, guests on the podcast to tell me about the leadership lesson. So 1994, looking back to, junior Omid showing up in the corporate world. I know you're wiser now than you were then. What is the wisdom around leadership that you would share with your younger self and with all of our listeners out there?
I think it's two things, and I actually did these well. So if you will, I'm learning from my own kind of accomplishments, but the first is pay attention to what's eating everybody alive inside your department. And there's always things, and pick one, take the time to become an expert in that and quietly solve the problem. Just quietly solve it. Don't make a public service announcement. Don't tell people, starting Monday, I want to do this, or get approval from your boss. Don't do any of those things, because then you'll find yourself, instead of solving problems, you'll find yourself writing PowerPoint presentations. And the second thing is related to the first, which is don't wait for other people to crown you. You can crown yourself. And just do things, solve problems, attack it, create solutions, and pursue those things, and be unapologetic. Just make smart decisions as you go. And then what happens is, organically, this was what happened to me. Other people figure it out. They start coming to you for advice. You become a internal consultant to the organization. Management figures that out, and they want to promote you. Other leaders figure it out, and they want to hire you, and you'll never have to look for a job again. But always look to solve problems, always be comfortable crowning yourself, and then elevate the people around you. And if you just repeat that cycle, good things happen for sure.
That's awesome. I think when you say crown yourself, I think what you're saying is don't ask for permission. Is that what you mean?
I mean, yeah, don't ask for permission that I want to start driving this effort on Monday. I want to start solving this problem for everyone on Monday. Just do it. No public service announcement.
Oh my gosh. I love this. It's fantastic. It's interesting that you talked about your first experience kind of getting your job down to 15 hours a week, because when I have similar conversations with individuals asking me how they can be successful, I tell them, you've got to figure out how to get your job done in 30 hours a week. Like, you've got to be able to do that, because you need that other 10 or 20 hours a week to do the kind of things that you're talking about. You need to move the needle. You need to make a difference. You've got to be able to solve problems. If you can do those things, you're absolutely a hero to your company, to your stakeholders, your organization. And by the way, it is 1,000 times more fun to be a difference maker, in the game playing instead of just a scorekeeper. So,
sure.
What a pleasure. You and I have had so much experience together way back in time. It's so much fun to get back together with you again. As I'm having this conversation, I'm thinking about my buddies, Natasha and Zach. When they listen to this episode, I can tell you right now, they're going to be a little miffed that I didn't invite them to come and participate as well, because I'm sure they have 1,000 questions. So don't be surprised if I reach back to you again here in the next month or two, and we dive into that next level of depth with them. I'm sure they're gonna have some thoughts and ideas as well.
Would be my pleasure.
All right, everybody, don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, and share. We'd like to get this and other episodes out to everybody out there that's looking for the best practical insights on how to do better in procurement. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.